Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times. I'm the Man of the West, also from the Prancing Pony podcast. Let's keep week 27 going here with today's Tolkien Tuesday. Now, last week, we began looking at the revised and expanded edition of Tolkien's letters, edited by Humphrey Carpenter and Christopher Tolkien. We didn't get into any of the letters themselves. I'm sure there was much disappointment. But that changes today, as I share and discuss some of the new content found only in this new edition of the volume. Now, there are more than 150 all-new letters in this revised and expanded edition. I'm certainly not going to be able to cover all of them, nor will I be able to cover all 45 updated letters. But I'll do my best to hit some of the highlights over the coming weeks, and I'm going to start with a series of 3 letters that Tolkien wrote to his sons between 1934 and 1936 that are all new to this volume. Now, in the original version, we went from July 1925 in letter number 8 to James Bailey, the Vice-Chancellor of Leeds, in which Tolkien expressed his feelings of great regret at having to leave Leeds in order to take his professorship at Oxford, all the way to almost 12 years later in January 1937 in letter 9 to Susan Dagnall at Allen and Unwin. Now, though, we get to have letters 8A, 8B, and 8C, written between January 1934 and October 1936 to John, Christopher, and Michael. Let's start with 8A to Tolkien's oldest son, John. Now, in 1934, John was 16, studying at a Catholic boarding school in Berkshire, about 25 miles to the south of where Tolkien was at Oxford. And hopefully I pronounced that correctly. It looks like Berkshire, folks, but I'm pretty sure it's Berkshire. That's what I hear from our English friends. Now, apparently John had gotten a less than stellar grade in Latin, as Tolkien starts the letter saying, "I am disappointed about your Latin credit, but cheer up, I expect you did your best. God bless you." Now, he also reminds John that things are about to get harder. This is the time, at 16, when, as Tolkien says, life will become a little grim for you now. You are on the verge of the serious years, in which there is a good deal of work and not so much play. Oof. Now, apparently, John had been ill recently, as Tolkien says he hopes that he's rid now of the last shreds of your cold and feeling fitter in the better air. And finally, he reminds John not to neglect Mummy's cards or letters. She counts on them more than you can realize. I'm willing to share, though we both miss you constantly and equally, unless there's something you really wish to consult Father on. Just a sweet letter. Now, 2 years later, in August of 1936, he writes to Christopher, who was then only 11. My son is 11. I'm trying to imagine being apart from my son long enough that I have to write him a handwritten letter. Christopher was at the time on holiday in Exeter with family friends. Tolkien had accompanied him to London. The professor writes, "I miss you very much, but I'm so glad that your little holiday has begun with fine weather. It did not look like it in London, did it? It was cold and miserable when you went off, and it drizzled in the afternoon. I found when I got home that they had had quite a fine and fairly warm day in Oxford." And he talks about having spent the preceding day in the garden. He lets him know that Priscilla, who was only 6 at the time, had caught her older brother's cold and is in bed today, but I don't think she is very poorly. And he imagines that she'll recover just fine by the next day. Now, interestingly, he tells Christopher that the Pearl was done very badly, I thought, on Friday night. Now, a footnote to the letter explains that Tolkien had given the BBC permission to have part of his translation of the Middle English poem read on the radio, and it wasn't done very well. Another oof. And we get another interesting update right after that when he tells Christopher that The Hobbit is now nearly finished and the publisher's clamoring for it. Even early on, at the tender age of 11, it seems that Christopher is the one that Tolkien talks to about his writing, as we don't see anything of The Hobbit in his letter to John or in the next one to Michael. That letter is written just 2 months later in October of 1936. Now, Michael at this point is about to turn 16. He's studying at the same boarding school in Berkshire where John had been attending. He's a little short on cash at the moment, and Tolkien has heard about it. And in an echo of a million letters, emails, and texts from fathers to sons says, "Under the circumstances, I guess that a spot of the necessary would be a most welcome form of birthday present. I send 10 shillings in a postal order. This is a birthday tip." Now, folks, there are 20 shillings to a pound, and a pound in 1936 is worth about 60 pounds today, or about $75. So 10 shillings is 30 pounds, or about $38 in today's money. Now, Tolkien goes on to say, "I can provide a little more regular pocket money later on, but not much. Sorry to allude to it in a birthday letter, but I'm hard up." He mentioned that, of course, he's the one who has to pay Michael's rent and furnish his room, and that this all comes out of his regular income, plus he adds any little windfalls, of course, though just now there are no apples on the father tree. That hits home, too. He discusses an injury that Michael is dealing with, saying that he's delighted to hear the hand goes on well. A footnote explains that Michael had cut his hand rather seriously on a window at the school earlier in the year. In fact, Tolkien concludes his letter to his son with a mention of seeing Michael the next day in order to take him to visit Growler immediately after. Growler is apparently G.R. Girdlestone, a professor of orthopedic surgery at Oxford. Now, in glancing over a list of all the new letters, it seems that many of them are letters to family. In fact, the fine folks over at Tolkien Collector's Guide have broken it down for us. 40% of the new letters are family letters, and most of those are to his children, especially Christopher. And I'm looking forward to these slice of life letters. For now, though, this wraps up this week's Tolkien Tuesday. Be sure to join me again next week as we keep diving into this treasure trove. Please visit patreon.com/TolkienTimes to learn how you can support the show, get an ad-free feed, be a part of my content council, get a bonus weekly episode, a whole lot more. And join me again tomorrow on today's Tolkien Times for Word Nerd Wednesday. If you're watching this on YouTube, please be sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Please follow or subscribe in your podcast apps and follow at Tolkien Times on social media. Finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.